Oh, hey, welcome to Life Point. All right, hey, listen, we've been in a series called My Dysfunctional Family, and we're in week 4 of that series, and we've been talking about the last week, and then this week, talking about train up a child in the way that he should go. When he's old, he won't depart from it. Man, I got to catch my breath. Dang, out of shape. So we talked first week about the importance of what our kids catch. You know, we learn and we train by what we catch and what's caught and what's taught. So we talked about what was caught and how it's important to have that inside of our hearts. But this week, we've talked about how to, what's taught and the things that we teach our children and the instructions that we give. And those instructions are rules and guidelines and consequences for life. Those are the things that we teach our kids. Those are the things we instruct them in. And here's our expectations. This is what we want you to do and why we want you to do it. And that's the important thing. And so we talked about that. And there's a passage of Scripture that we read that has kind of become controversial, and it's in Proverbs chapter 13. It says, "Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." And so a lot of times people use this passage to defend the right to spank their children. And so I'm not saying that you don't have that right as a parent to spank your children, but that's mainly why they use that verse. And what they need to understand is this verse has way more in it than just permission for you and I to spank. But there's a balance in our lives. We've got to instill balance in our families. And we've got to understand the difference between discipline and punishment. We have to understand the need for rules and consequences. That we don't, we have to live in that balance. And so we have to understand the difference between those things and their place. And so we talked about the rod and what it means. And, the rod in the Old Testament was not just for correction. It was for direction, correction, and protection. And the shepherd carried a rod and a staff. And there was a different, the purpose wasn't just to beat the sheep. And so for those who just think, if I just beat my kids, they'll be all right. No, you've got to discipline them. You've got to teach them rules and guidelines and boundaries. And then you also have to have consequences. What happens when they don't do this or that? And so this is important in the instruction of our children. And the most important part of this verse, I think, is the last part. It says, be careful in the way that you discipline your children. A lot of times, we don't put a whole lot of thought into it. We just kind of react. Instead of being intentional in our parenting, instead of having a plan, instead of having rules that we clearly explain to our kids. Now, I know if they're little, it's kind of hard for them to get it, although they can understand you don't touch that. That's mama's nice thing, or that's daddy's thing. You don't touch, this is dangerous. You can explain a little bit, but as they get older, you got to explain those things. And sometimes the things that, some of our rules, we don't even know that they're rules. They just kind of, it depends on how we feel. This is why it's important that we're careful how we discipline, that we put thought into it, we put intentionality into it, that we're not just winging it, flying by the seat of our pants as parents, or however we feel, and however, our kids are, that if they're good or bad, we've got to have a plan. We have to be the ones that instill and teach those rules, those guidelines, those boundaries, but also the consequences. Here's what's going to happen if you do this. See here, the whole reason for this, the whole reason to train up our children and to teach them these things is because we're trying to reach their heart. We're not looking for just obedience, but we want to transfuse those values, those character traits that are in us into our kids. We want them to have it so that when they get older, when we launch them out into life, what we talked about last week, we launch them into life, they have a good, solid reason for what they do. The things that those values are theirs. It'll help ground them in decision making that, if they don't have them, could destroy their lives. And so it's about submission, not obedience. It's about captivating and capturing their heart, reaching their heart. And the same thing God's trying to do with us. He's trying to reach our heart. He's trying for us to submit to His word, His plan, His commands, so that those things that He commands in His word are not just words on a page, or not just things that we obey because we're afraid of the consequences, but we have them in us and they guide us and they direct our lives. See, without discipline, there is no direction. And so it's important for us to get that deep inside of our hearts. In your discussion time, here's what I want you to look at. Talk about, some of the things that you experienced growing up. We all have different stories, and they could take a lot of time. But talk about your experience. Did your parents, did they punish you for things? If they did, what were some of the things that they did to punish? What were some of the rules that your parents had? Can you actually articulate those rules and guidelines and boundaries that your parents had for you? And what are some of the boundaries or rules that you have for your family? What are the things that you want to see happen? And what are some of the consequences? If you don't know those, if you don't know how to articulate the rules, and if you don't know what the consequences are, then you're just going to react. And it could turn out really bad. God bless you. Have a great week.